Hello, and welcome to the week two of our discussion of strategic nuclear targeting. This week we're going to go through an article written by Desmond Ball, our editor number one. The title of the article is called Toward a Critique of Strategic Nuclear Targeting. It is to a large extent a summary of the upcoming 13 chapters that we're going to go through anyway. Let's see what Professor Ball has to say. So from last week's discussion, we know that part of the reason why the public is focusing more on nuclear targeting is from the declassification of the targeting policies of the 50s. The targeting in the 50s was illogical and somewhat arbitrary. Additionally, there were three developments in the 60s that refocuses the interest in targeting. Number one is improved weapon accuracies. So in the background here on the postcard, we've got the first official missile mail from the US Post, and it was actually advertised being the future of postal services using missile, shooting ICBM across the US states, and instead of warhead, they put packages and letters in there. I don't think there will ever be a point that they were seriously considering sending letters using missiles, but it was more of a message to the Soviets saying, look at how accurate our missiles are, don't screw with us. So it's more of a propaganda thing. The second development that we have in the 60s is a more improved command and control system, or the C3I system, command, control, communication and intelligence. And with better command and control, policymakers thought that they could use nuclear weapon in a more flexible fashion. They can use the weapon in more accurate way, if you will. And the third development is that there was thought to be a reduced US advantage in the strategic weapons. If you have less weapons, even in relative terms, you must actually use the weapons more wisely in a more discerning way. So that's the development in the 60s that refocus the public and policymakers on the targeting issue. Here I've got a table here I got from Wikipedia. I've massaged the data a little bit. This is an ICBM by operator, by country, by range, and also by the mobility. But the column that we're interested here is called the average CEP. CEP stands for Circular Error Probable. It's basically the 50% chance of a round that will land on the radius. So if we look at a circular error probable of an R7 rocket, the Russian rockets here, it has a 5,000 meters CEP, means that 50% of the chance, 50% of the round will actually land within 5,000 meters or 5 kilometers within your target. So I've got this data from Wikipedia. I massaged it a little bit and I sorted by year. Some of them are projected CEPs. If you look at some of the Indian rockets here, they claim to have a CEP of 5 meters. We'll see whether that's true or not. But if you just plot the graph, even if you're ignoring future development, it's undeniable that rockets and missiles are certainly getting a lot more accurate, yes. So we have established that weapons are getting better, increasingly accurate. What about missile gaps? Overall, there were two periods that Americans thought that they have a narrowing strategic advantage or a missile gap. One is towards the end of the 50s. Eisenhower, the president back then, thought that they spent way too much money on defense expenditure, and they tried to reduce the defense spending. And he actually made us aware about the power of the military-industrial complex, the things getting out of hand. But that was claimed by Kennedy as being weak. So Kennedy actually said, oh, we need to rebuild defenses, we need a stronger America. And that captured American attention, although we would argue that he knew full well that there wasn't a missile gap. He received NSA briefing, he received CIA briefing, the gap is not real. But it was still being used to capture the attention of the American people. The second one is also not true. In 1974, someone claimed that there was a missile gap. It's no good, but it was later debunked by Henry Kissinger. American actually has a 6-1 advantage. Missile gap wasn't true either. But even if you look at today, there are a lot of claims that the Chinese have hypersonic weapons, or if you watch Top Gun 2, the enemy has 5th generation fighters, and we only have F-18 Super Hornets. No good, they are a lot better. It's such a constant theme about a gap, but just looking at the technology, just looking at the numbers will probably not give you a full picture of what's actually going on. So as you can see, missile accuracy varies widely even between missiles within the same era. From a Russian R-7 with a 5-kilometer CEP to a Chinese Dongfeng 5 rocket with a claimed CEP of 1,000 meters to a Trident launched from an Ohio submarine with a 400-ish meter range. With that differences in the CEP, focusing on targeting makes sense for some nations. Now, before we continue our discussion, we must talk about different types of nuclear policies here. At the top level, the highest level is your declarative policy. Now, your declarative policy is what you say you're going to do at a national strategic level. This is also where you tell your countrymen what you're going to do. At the bottom, we got the action policy, which is defined by your SIOP in the case of the US. It describes launch process, theater commands, etc. And in between, you've got your acquisition and your allocation policies. Basically, what you're going to build, what capability you're going to acquire, or in some cases, what are you going to buy. The credibility of your nuclear policies depends on how closely these three things matches together. And if we look at the case of UK and the French nuclear policy, later on we'll see some discrepancies between the declarative policy and the action plan, or some discrepancies between the declarative policy to what they are actually buying. We're going to see that. So chapter 2 of the book is about the US nuclear war planning between 1945 to 1960s, which is the US nuclear policies before we have the SIOP. Now remember, before the SIOP, these plans were criticized as being too illogical or too arbitrary, and we'll see what they meant by that. But primarily during that time, the focus was to destroy Soviets' war-making capacities. What do you mean by that? We killed their nuclear weapon, we killed their military capabilities. We might also kill their cities, because you argue that the industry, the government, all that are supporting a war effort. So we tried to prevent them from starting a war. We basically destroyed everything that they have. That's the policy back then. Remember the three policies that we have, which is your declarative policy, your acquisition, and then your action. During that time, your acquisition and your action plan are closely interconnected, so they agree with each other. But we will see that there is a disconnect between your declarative policy and the rest of the plan, which we'll look at later. And chapter 3 of the book focuses on the US development of the SIOP. The SIOP stands for Single Integrated Operations Plan. Single means single, there's only one of them. The US president is going to use it, single. Integrated means that it integrated all the strategic forces, which is the land-based ICBM, the air-based bombers, and the sea-based strategic missile submarines, integrating the three. Operations plan means that the plan describes your launch procedure and your target sets. So the first SIOP 62, came into effect in 1961, focuses on massive retaliation. And then under Kennedy administration, Kennedy-McNamara wanted flexible response. So the SIOP actually has a target set that includes no cities. So that's one option of the plan. Now these plans are confidential, they're highly classified, and we can only have glimpses on these plans at a high level. But the number of targets changes over the years in each of the update, but sometimes it ranges from 12,000 targets to 16,000 targets to 50,000 targets. And if you look at these numbers from a 2022 perspective, in the 80s, we're seeking to destroy tens of thousands of targets using nuclear weapon is truly incredible. And by incredible, I don't only mean that it is amazing. Incredible means that it's not really credible. I don't believe that they will actually do that. One of the problem with SIOP 1 or SIOP 62, is that the concept of massive retaliation is incredible, that people don't tend to believe it. It is a choice between suicide or humiliation. That's the main problem with massive retaliation or a full-scale nuclear war. So there are additional issues with targeting. If you're not using massive retaliation, targeting is important, but targeting has its own issue. You're assuming that in a nuclear war, you still can control your troops. You can still have an effective command and control systems. In reality, after 10,000 detonation and after a few days of nuclear war, you probably won't have a functioning C3I system. Secondly, of course, is that only part of your SIOP going to work. Your plan is perfect, your target set is perfect, but then employable assets have been drastically reduced. And so suddenly you have to haphazardly select your targets. Thirdly, your SIOP, remember, is secret. It's only significant to your targeteers, the people who write that plan, and the President of the United States. You won't be able to communicate your target plans with your opponent and say, hey, here's our logical choice, what do you think? It doesn't happen. And so it means that your SIOP doesn't serve any purpose on the negotiation table. It doesn't serve any purpose to bargain your war termination or your peace term. And of course, when you're getting punched in the face, emotion take over. And so your assumption that everyone will behave logically and everyone can exercise restraint goes out of the window after your first detonation. Chapter 4 focuses on the development of the Soviet nuclear strategy. Remember, this is a 1986 book. It was the peak of Cold War. You can't say, oh, we foresee that Soviet will collapse. People will still think that Soviet Union is a huge threat. It's a massively formidable opponent. And the West really thought that the Soviet has a really capable nuclear force, which they did. And they also thought that their nuclear capability aligned quite well with their targeting doctrine. So we're going to look at that, look at how the Soviet targets the states in Chapter 4. In Chapter 5, we're going to look at the UK nuclear targeting policies. So in the 1960s, they have accepted NATO's doctrine on flexible responses. And quite significant to the UK is that they have given up on the V bombers. So they don't actually have a land-based ICBM either. So they're only going to rely on the strategic submarines to maintain their nuclear deterrence. They have, although they have given up on the V bombers early on, they have only retired their gravity bombs, the WE-177 tactical bombs in 1998. So they've maintained 4 nuclear submarines, the Vanguard class submarines, to maintain a credible threat. The Vanguard class are very capable, 16 missiles, and each of the missiles can carry 4 to 8 warheads in the UK case. The V-bombers, the Valiants, the Vulcans, and the Victors, at the peaks they have about 100, 150 of them. So the problem is that the Soviet has developed better missiles, and the Soviet have also developed better radar. And the question of survivability of bombers in the future is quite real. These are not stealth, these are not supersonic, and so the height is their probably only defenses. And so back then there was the concept of an air launch ballistic missile, or ALBM, the Skybolt. But then the Skybolt was cancelled by the US, and so without Skybolt, using a free fall bomb or some other bomb without a lot of range, these bombers are becoming very vulnerable to the Soviet defenses. Interestingly, although the Americans stopped developing the concept of an ALBM, the Chinese, the Dongfeng 17, the Dongfeng 21, and some of the Russian KH missile, they still have the concept of an air launch ballistic weapon in use. So the logic back then is that, if we can't use an air launch weapons, these aircraft will need to fly low and slow into Soviet Union, and they won't be able to survive, and we must actually move on. And so they move on to the Trident submarines, or actually the Trident nuclear program with Vanguard submarines. So they built 4. They concluded they needed 4. Under recent revision, they tried to reduce the number to 3, but they still said, we still need 4, which is true. At the peak, these Vanguard class can carry 16 missiles. Each of the missiles can carry 4 to 8 warheads. But in the 2000s, with the reduction of nuclear threat, these weapons have reduced in half. So only 8 out of 16 silos are filled with a missile, and only up to 40 warheads in each of the boat. And even the targeting time has increased. So previously, these missiles are pre-targeted. We know what to launch, where to launch it. But nowadays, in the 2000s, the programming of these missiles will take days. They will receive the targeting information from the PM, and within days, they can launch a nuclear missile. So God save the Queen. So chapter 6, we're going to talk about the nuclear targeting policies of the French. If we look at UK's policies, they have a declarative policy of flexible response, isn't it? But with 4 ballistic submarines, what they have capable in terms of hardware, it's far beyond what they are needed. Which is the opposite case of the French nuclear policies. The author of Chapter 6 argued that the French nuclear hardware and their acquisition and allocation policy is barely sufficient to fulfill their declarative policy. Interestingly, at least in 1986, the French has an anti-cities declarative policy. So the deterrence is that we will kill your cities, which is quite a grand nuclear targeting plan. So we're going to look at the French case. So if also interested, look at the movie called Wolf's Call. It is a French movie about their strategic nuclear submarine. Quite interesting. You should be able to find it on Netflix. Chapter 7, we're going to talk about the dilemma of counter-power targeting. In general, to employ a nuclear weapon strategically, we can try to destroy the enemy's military, or we can try to destroy enemy's economy, or we can actually target their people. The counter-power targeting focuses on the first one, which is destroying their military. Um, the targeting of the military itself comes with some obvious problem. One is that if we're trying to destroy the enemy's nuclear capabilities, we're kind of relying on a massive first strike because you are relying or betting on them not launching a counterattack on alert. Secondly, if we are taking the US perspective, is that the Soviet Union is so large, it is a geographically vast area, and so their bases are very dispersed. They're basically everywhere. So if you're targeting on their forces, when you have thousands of incoming missiles, the Soviet would have no idea what you're targeting because they're so dispersed. Are you killing our people? Are you killing the cities? Are you killing our industry? Or are you killing our military? They wouldn't know that. It will be indistinguishable from an all-out nuclear attack of everything. On the other side, if we take in the Soviet perspective, if they are going to have a counter-power strike, most of the US strategic nuclear forces are in Central of America, central of the United States. So it will be slightly easier for the US to tell, oh, they're killing our nuclear forces, or they're killing our assets instead of killing our people. But so what? Even if you're going to be able to discern that the Soviet is trying to eliminate the US strategic bases only, even if you have 100% certainty that the Soviet is launching against the ICBM force, does that mean that you're not going to launch and retaliate? Does that mean that there's no civilian casualties? It doesn't, right? If you have a massive counterpower, massive counterforce attack, from both sides, it kind of looks similar to an all-out nuclear war. It kind of looks similar to an all-out anti-population, anti-economy, anti-everything war. So that's the problem of a counter-power strike. So we see the issues with a counter-power attack. The counter-power attack focusing on enemy's strategic forces will look too similar to an all-out nuclear war. So what other options do people actually have? The first one is to target the political leaderships. The second one is actually targeting conventional forces, or OMT, other military targets. Or you can have a limited war with a theater that's closer to a tactical war rather than strategic war, but yes, that's one option. Or you can go all in, all out, all in nuclear war. So if we look at the first option of targeting Soviet's leadership, is that you can't really tell what do you mean by leaderships. The Soviet Union in the 80s has 100,000 people as classified as leadership. So if you're targeting all the communist headquarters and government buildings, etc., there are a lot of them. Again, the same problem. It will look too similar to an anti-city attack. And if you're targeting on the Soviet leadership, the Soviet leadership will say, fuck that, I have nothing to lose, let's go all in and I'll fight you. Another problem with Soviet leadership is that they have a lot of bunkers. They build a lot of bunkers. Some of them can sustain 1,000 psi. A lot of them can sustain 600 psi overblast. To give you an idea of a psi, an aircraft will get destroyed with 3 psi. A communication center will get destroyed with 5 psi. So 1,000 psi bunker, they will be able to survive. The leadership will be able to survive a nuclear strike. So that's a hard problem to solve. Another problem with an anti-leadership strike is that who are you going to negotiate with? Even if you succeeded, you need to negotiate war termination. And in a nuclear war, when the launching and when the fighting capability are actually transferred to field commanders, you have to have an effective way to negotiate war termination. A successful leadership strike will actually deny you that option. What about other military target? Yes, you can. You can employ your nuclear weapon against conventional forces, against some bases, etc. There are a lot of bases in the Soviet Union back then. And how you're going to target these OMT will largely dictated by what crisis that you're facing at the time. So we can't comment, but targeting a limited military target is an option. But again, to the Soviet Union, a missile or incoming missiles coming, it's very hard to discern whether it is a limited war or is it an all-out attack. And during Cold War, it is not only the Soviet fighting the US, not only the US against the Soviet Union, there are a lot of smaller players, and it could become a regional conflict. And in Chapter 8, we were going to study that in detail as well. So a limited regional area, say in European theaters, there's still thousands of Warsaw Pact targets back then. And also targeting a second echelon forces. Again, depending on the crisis that you have at hand, if you destroy the second echelon forces, that will interrupt their reinforcement. Maybe that's a good option. We don't know. But one of the problem again is that you have limited warhead. So if you want that flexible targeting options instead of programming for days, if you want to adjust it within hours and minutes, there are only limited missiles that you can use, and these missiles are actually being employed at pointing at more strategically important targets. So how are you going to divert these important assets? It's worth considering. So from all the previous options, whether it is counter power, whether it is counter leadership, whether it is OMT, other military target options, the central theme of these targeting problem is that the Soviet Union cannot really tell whether it is a general attack or an all-out nuclear war, or if your targets are limited. But what about an actual general nuclear war? On Chapter 8, we are finally going to look at what a general nuclear war is going to look like. A general nuclear war, from the West perspective, we are looking at 25,000 targets, including 500 airfields, including army camps, including naval bases, and some of these naval bases would have strategic forces on there. So the priority of targeting is very important. You might need to clear SAM sites that are in the bomber's path so that the bombers can fly in, watch Top Gun 2, or you need to clear some of the strategic nuclear base before a submarine can sail or receive commands. So all of these are interesting considerations. But if you look at the Soviet target sets, the Soviet Union is much more closed society. So the information about where things are a lot harder for the US targetees to find out. And on the other hand, the US intelligence is probably be easier to gather from a Soviet perspective. And also in Soviet Union, a lot of them are very heavily defended. The Soviet bases are arguably better defended or better concealed compared to the bases in the US. So that's also interesting. It's covered in Chapter 8. Chapter 9, it's about targeting economics of the Soviet Union. This is really a chapter to show how crazy things were back then. There could be three objectives in targeting the Soviet economy. One is to weaken them, so you can target the economy and destroy some of them to weaken them. Or you can say, oh, okay, well, I need to destroy really your economy to stop you from fighting a war somewhere. But the third one is actually try to slow them down from recovery. So the thinking is that we need to fight a nuclear war. After you fought a nuclear war, we need to slow down your recovery. So some of the model projected the Soviet economy will get recovered within five years after nuclear war. Everything is overly optimistic. We really thought Soviet was such a big threat back then. But some history is that in the 40s, the US is trying to suppress the Soviets' war-making capabilities. And in the 60s, the massive retaliation and the concept of deterrent came in. And so the thinking is that if we can destroy half of the Soviet economy to 2/3 of the Soviet economy, that would be a big enough deterrent so that we can have a stability that no one wants to fight this war. And in the 70s, it comes back to, yep, we will fight this war. It's likely that we're going to fight this war. We need to destroy your economy so that you don't recover that fast. That's the craziness of the Cold War time. And then in the 80s, we come back to the dual use. One is that we will destroy the war-making capability, and also we will focus on recovery after nuclear war. Very grim, very crazy, very interesting. Chapter 10 is also about targeting the economy, but the focus, instead of hindering war-making capability or hindering the growth of the Soviet Union, this is now about slowing down the recovery. So Chapter 10 discusses whether there are choke points, whether there are bottlenecks industry that you can target to slow down the recovery. During the peak of Cold War, we tend to overestimate the size and the power of the enemy. The projection was that after suffering several thousand nuclear detonations, the projection was that Soviet Union will be able to fully recover within 4 to 5 years' time. We know that it's not true now, but the thinking back then is there anything that we should target that will choke them and so they will recover slower? So the thinking, the example given was that we will attack the ball bearing factory. If they can't make ball bearings, they can't make tanks, they can't make cars, they can't make fidget spinners. Without ball bearings, they will suffer, and therefore we should target ball bearing factory. That's only one example. In 2020, obviously that's different. In 2020, we now need to choke the supply chain for silicon chips. Things have changed, and I look forward to discuss Chapter 10 with you on exemplary industry targets for control conflict. Chapter 11, population targeting, and a lot of you have been waiting for this one. In short, the United States of America does not target the civilian per se. It does not target the population per se. Per se means in itself or intrinsically. We won't be targeting your people, but we can absolutely target your military target, we can target your economy, you can target your industry, we can target your leadership, we can even target your cities. And if that city has a lot of people in it, too bad. We're not really targeting your population per se, we're only targeting your largest city. So please evacuate. It is a very interesting topic, but very grim. And the injunction against population targeting can only be taken at the technical and at the mechanics of it, rather than actually meaningfully say that we can avoid civilian casualties in a nuclear war. Chapter 12 of this book will talk about targeting nuclear energy. Targeting power generation and targeting energy sources is nothing new. I mean, since you have war and since you have energy sources are constant consideration in military operations and targeting. The difference, of course, is the long-term ramification and the short-term impact of these strikes. You can render land inhabitable for at least 50 years if you do target a reprocessing plant or you target a fuel fabrication facility. So in chapter 12, we're going to talk about that. Chapter 13, ethnic targeting, some bad ideas. Chapter 13 has a discussion on targeting on certain racial or certain ethnic groups in a nuclear attack. It was quite a fanciful and naive idea. That's not my opinion. That's what Desmond Ball wrote in the book. It is fanciful and naive because the completely ignoring the technical difficulties in executing that, and you're also ignoring the escalatory dynamics. So in theory, you try to kill the Russian because the Russian was responsible for a nuclear war, they do bad things, and you want to spare all the non-Russian population, like the Ukrainian, like the Armenian, etc. That sounds good in theory, but to separate the Russian and non-Russian population and only targeting Russian in theory will also deter the Russian from doing anything bad. And also it is morally wrong to attack captive people. The theory is that all these people under the Soviet system are actually hostages, and if you kill them, you're essentially killing the hostage. Sounds good in theory, doesn't work, isn't it? Because in practice, if you're actually racially dividing targets, you are conducting genocide. Secondly, you can also argue the Russians are being held captive. You can say that the Russians are being held as a hostage of the Soviet communist leadership. You can say that they are also the victims of a dictator. But the more obvious point is that it cannot technically be done. You can't really divide them that perfectly. They are a mix of people within a land. And finally, even if you are targeting the Russian population in a non-Russian land, from a Ukrainian perspective or from a Kazakh perspective, all they know is that we're being nuked by the American. We are being nuked. They won't think of the historical context. They won't know that the nuke wasn't targeting them. So the nuclear weapons in this context is actually pretty useless. I mean, too fanciful. You might as well say that I have invented a point of view gun from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the movie that you point and shoot and they think like you do. It is as fanciful as that. But we're going to discuss this later in chapter 13. Chapter 14 is our last chapter of the book Strategic Nuclear Targeting, and we will be focusing on war termination in the nuclear context. If you subscribe to the Clausewitz view of war, war is a continuation of politics by other means. Your employment of force should be related to clear and discrete political objectives, and these objectives should be achievable without total destruction of your enemy or the total exhaustion of your arsenal. In these chapters, we're going to look at some problems of nuclear war termination, such as technical problem in communication, communication with your enemy, communication with your own troops, and also the political strategic problem. What value does a nuclear weapon brings to the negotiation table, and also a large government decision-making process in the context of a nuclear war. I do look forward to talk to you about this in chapter 14. And that concludes our introductory discussion of strategic nuclear targeting and a summary of chapter 2 of the book. Next week, we're going to talk about US nuclear strategy from 1945 to 1960s before the SIOP.